talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I am Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
You know, I'm doing okay. It's Thursday, so one more day to the weekend. If there is such a thing, I'm not sure at this point.
When's the last time you've gone outside?
Oh, I've been going outside. I took the dogs for a walk yesterday, went around the block. So does that count?
That is part of outside, yeah.
I've been to the grocery market, so,
Okay.
I'm out there, wearing a mask, doing all the right things, trying to stay clean and healthy.
I feel like I'm clean and healthy, but I have not been wearing a mask that often, honestly. And I feel like I think things are moving in the right direction toward getting back to normal. It's such a political hot button, Jeff, and this is not a political show, so I think we should stick to our sweet spot, which is identity at the center.
Identity at the center. IAM. Is that something that we do? I'm not sure.
What is IAM?
What is IAM? Yeah, that's the question. Well, speaking of IAM, there was another report that came out today. One from our friends at the Identity Defined Security Alliance. They commissioned a report taking a look at the different benefits, challenges, and different enterprise efforts that have been going on for companies looking to adopt an identity-centric approach to security. Looks like they surveyed around 500 people or so, and they were looking at companies that had 1,000 or more employees. So this is kind of fresh off the presses, so we're kind of scanning it and reading it here as we're talking about it. But they had some interesting findings just at kind of the first glance. I think the most important one, then probably the one they lead off with, is 94% of these respondents have said that their companies have experienced an identity-related breach, which, that's everybody.
It's a high percentage. And the other thing on top of it is, I think, to back up the train a little bit, and you talked about who completed this survey, and these are people who are in the trade, right? These are people who are security professionals and kind of would know. 94%. 94%, and then of those, it was 74% said it was within the past 2 years. So I guess 20% of those were 2 years or older, but the large majority have had an identity-related breach within the past 2 years. That's a number that really floored me. But what I would say is that almost any breach that exists is identity-related. I mean, can you talk about a breach that's not identity-related? Yeah, there's some, brute force attacks and denial of service attacks that can lead to, systems becoming compromisable. But for the most part, it's usually you got some form of credentials for some user account, human or non-human, and you're able to log in. We have that one slide that we use all the time, Jeff, which is, a quote that we heard at Gartner. Hackers don't break in, they log in.
Yep. And that's totally true, right? It's not, what is that, 80% or something like that, go back to some sort of credential. That is usually the way that people get in. And, it's unfortunate sometimes that it takes a breach to get something done in an organization, right? I mean, there's forward-looking, there's neutral, and there's kind of like reactive organizations, but we're still in this mindset of where, we'll deal with that when it happens. Maybe not by choice, but by budget or, by timing, but that's still kind of where we're at. And yeah, you're right. I mean, I think it's 79% have had an identity-related breach within the past 2 years. So 94% overall, let's say 79% over the last 2 years. That just means that it's still a very common thing. And there's a variety of different methods that people are going to do it, but phishing seems to still be the most predominant, with about 2/3 of the people saying that was the most common reason or the most common cause for the different types of breaches. So
it's kind of a head scratcher in a way. I mean, it makes sense because it's like, tricking people into coughing up their credentials seems like, okay, that's the easy way to do it. But it's also a thing where gosh, multi-factor authentication sure would take care of most of those problems. Even if you have my password, if you can't get in. So there's kind of two things at play here. One is that, because we think, I mean, your mind, when you hear about identity related breaches, your mind immediately goes to there's some nefarious hacker in a coffee shop somewhere, and he's got
Right. A
one of
hoodie,
those a hoodie and one of
that
those weirdo masks
right Guy
on. It's
Fawkes
like,
mask.
yeah, but what I know we have another one of our favorite slides is the percentage of breaches that occur through that are internal.
Hmm.
It's a really high percentage compared to what you might expect. I think it's something like 35%. Do you remember
Yeah,
off the
it's
top of
right
your head?
around a third. It's like 2/3 are external, a third is internal. And, that when I say internal, it's employee, internal contractors, vendors, people who are not necessarily, on the outside of the firewall, so to speak. So the
Right.
internal and insider threat thing is definitely a vector. Now, what'll be interesting is, are those truly insider threats, people on the inside who are doing bad things, or someone who's gotten a hold of an insider credential and is then using it, right, to do
True.
things that they shouldn't be doing. So their number
Yeah,
may be skewed a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's still an identity.
there's that mix. And then when you think about MFA, you think, okay, in terms of priority, protecting the outer shell of the organization. If you have a VPN or you have VDIs, you definitely need to protect those using multi-factor. But one of the other statements, I'm going to point back to Gartner again because there's a lot of good stuff in their conference this year. But one of the quotes that really stuck with me is that the new baseline norm is MFA everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean? That doesn't mean that every time you go to a new application, you have to use an authenticator app or something like that. But what it does mean is that you have a session that has gone through MFA. So if if I go over to your desk, I see you wrote down your credentials on a piece of paper, and then I go back over to my desk and I go to log in with your credentials, it's going to see the new device.
Mm-hmm.
From an adaptive perspective, I need to prompt you not only for your credentials, but also for your second factor. And so it should stop. So really it's a combination of factors that go into this, but MFA has got to be, the core of the solution here. But the thing is,
Right.
it can't just be a piecemeal approach, or you're not really solving this entire problem.
Yeah, I mean, MFA should be standard, but it's still surprising to me how many established organizations still just don't have it ingrained as prevalent as it probably should be at this point. I can understand smaller teams, especially with the rush here to work from home, or smaller organizations, with the pandemic and having to work remotely, et cetera, having to scramble if that's not something that was part of their daily life before. But it's still surprising how many, big organizations just don't have MFA to the level that you would think they would at this point. One of the kickers here is we're kind of looking over the report, and 99% of the people believe their identity related breaches were preventable.
Right.
So, that tells you that it's like, okay, yeah, we should have done something about this, but we didn't, or we hadn't yet, or something along those lines. So, I don't know if that's good or bad, right? I guess it's good in the fact that there was an answer, bad in the fact that, nobody decided to apply the answer in the time before the breach hit.
Yeah, how does that quote go? That hindsight is 2020.
Hindsight's 2020.
Had you known that MFA could have prevented things, you obviously would have done it. Or, I think what happens is a lot of times we in the security field, we're going to point out this is what we need to do, but we're not the ultimate decision makers on whether or not to spend the money for that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
when I saw that number, the 99%, I didn't know whether to look at it as like, wow, or wow, that's almost everybody, or if it was to look at it as like, what's up with that other 1%? What are these hacks that
Right.
happen, these breaches that happen that could not be prevented? Um, and where I came down is that I think how people, these are human beings that were filling out the survey. And we run into people all the time who, with what you and I do is we work with clients, all different industries, and with people who represent different parts of business. But let's just talk about information security and people even within the same organization. But as we go from place to place, some people are very optimistic and some people are very pessimistic.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things. But 99% is almost 100%. Almost 100% of these breaches people felt like could have been prevented. But one of the things, kind of the next level in this document that talked about what was the main thing that they thought could be done to prevent breaches, or something like 75% of the people selected user education.
Yeah.
Awareness training.
Awareness training is usually the biggest one.
Yeah, there's kind of a hook within the document, which was like, all right, guys, so what you're saying, I thought this document is really well written, because it wasn't like, hey, we're just going to take it and whatever people said, we're just going to accept that. Because it kind of said, all right, guys, 75% of you were saying that it was the user's fault for falling for this. You're, in other words, yeah, we should have done more training because these stupid users went and got phished. Well, there's other way. What about MFA?
Right.
To me,
there could have been
having
some controls to help with it, right?
Right. If you had MFA in place and the person coughed up their credentials, it really wouldn't have mattered.
Yeah.
So I thought it was kind of cool that this document just didn't accept the answers as is, but threw that out there. But on the same token, I do think that security awareness training is critically important, because, as much as Gartner's saying the new baseline is MFA everywhere, I hardly ever see organizations that actually achieve that.
Yeah. Dollar for dollar, security awareness training has been, at least for the last several years, the most effective way to improve overall security. Doesn't solve all the issues, but pound for pound, that's the way to go. And I should note that we'll put a link to this report in the show notes, so you can drill down into the details wherever you're listening to this, and there will be a link in there for this identity defined security alignment report. And I think what's nice about this report too is that it's vendor neutral. It's not spun by, not to pick on anybody, but like CyberArk, who's looking to push PAM products on somebody. This is more of a neutral alliance, and they're not pushing any specific technology. It's definitely more informational. So I think that helps quite a bit with the messaging. But yeah, they did a really good job with it. And I'm just looking at the chart here for, the question was, in retrospect, is there anything that your company could have done to prevent or minimize this breach? And 71%, better security awareness training for our users. That was the number one answer on the board. And there's some other things on here too, like improved internal processes, better integration of existing technology, better in-house expertise around identity and security, better or wider implementation of technology they already own. And the last answer, really they had any kind of measurable number to it, 31% said purchase and deployment of new technology. So it seems like the answer out there is use the security awareness and things before, saying, oh yeah, we need to go out and buy something because we don't have the tools or methods to prevent breaches. So I thought that was interesting.
Right. I think one thing I was thinking as I was reading through this report, because they made a good effort to point out privileged access in this whole thing. Because what's important, I think, is like if you get Joe Schmo's login, the amount you can do with his or her login is limited. Right? You have to then try to figure out how to escalate privileges, and usually that's, I got onto the network with Joe Schmo's account. Now I'm going to try to get a privileged account, and that's how hackers usually work with these data breaches, because Joe Schmo, unless he's a DBA, is not going to be able to go and get that honeypot. And so, really managing those. This is my experience in working on a PCI project. PCI being the payment card industry, PCI DSS. It's basically the standard and regulatory framework for management of credit card data. And the idea was that most of the controls are focused on the ability to dump credit cards, not to go from screen to screen and get one at a time. It was about being able to steal large numbers of credit cards at a time, because that's really where your big risk is. If someone walks away with 25 credit card numbers or 25 pieces of personal data, yeah, there's still a little bit of a black eye, but it's not like a total disastrous event. It's when someone's able to download millions of records and just offload them from the company and throw them out on the internet or whatever. So that's why I think that if you're taking a risk-based approach, focusing on those privileged accounts. And one of the things that I thought, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, I read somewhere that these respondents talked about implementing least privilege for privileged accounts. And this is one of my hangups that I always have when I read information security policies for organizations, and they say, least privilege. And then they talk about, we need to have role-based access control. And the approach to role-based access control is, we're going to create a role and we're going to genericize access. In other words, we're going to give people access, that they don't need, because their type of person that they are fits this mode. And within that, we're going to group access. And ultimately what's going to happen is some of those people are going to have some access that they don't need. And, my personal feeling is that's probably all right if the risk is appropriate. However, when it comes to privileged access, the risk is not appropriate of giving somebody too much access. And that's where you really need to narrow down the channel. If you're using a privileged access management solution and you can control the authorization and the entitlements that somebody has, they can only, run certain commands at certain times through the control of the privileged access tool, then that's where you get to the kind of the nirvana state. And so all of that combined, I think it's all about managing your risk and putting your investment in the areas that pose the most risk. And the most risk comes from people being able to exfiltrate large amounts of data. Again, the Joe Schmo account can't do that, but privileged identities sure can. And that's where you have to have tools to manage them to have least privilege. And also you have to have really strong authorization and multi-factor authentication is an absolute minimum when it comes to those accounts.
Yeah. I feel like identity breaches are a numbers game. It's a volume business. You're not looking to dump 5 or 10 people their information unless it is a targeted, probably more of an espionage type thing, whether it's corporate or government. They want to go after the tens and hundreds of thousands or millions of records. And because those are so cheap, it doesn't make any money, typically to breach and say, oh yeah, we got 25 credit card numbers. Those are pennies on the dollar on the dark web. So, they're going after the rights and permissions that'll let them dump thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of records, entire databases, et cetera. And that stretches into privileged access space. And their role-based access control in the privileged access space should not exist. It should be minimum, maximum of least privilege at all times. And even then might be more on demand, if you've got the capability to swing it. But it should not, I feel like role-based access control does not apply to privileged workers.
I agree.
Makes sense, for standard kind of accesses that are out there, but definitely not in the privilege space.
Right.
And, that's sometimes, something I see where it's like, oh yeah, we step a vault and we gave everybody, who's in this team access to this vault in case they need it. Well, that's not great. That's not the way that I would do it. And you're opening up,
I think you made a really good point there, especially around like that espionage piece, which is that, everything I said can be taken with a grain of salt if you've got certain use cases, right? You're protecting very sensitive data, or the Joe Schmo account now has access to the healthcare information system. And I can go and see, kind of find celebrities within this system and start, exfiltrating, onesie twosie records. That is a big deal in certain industries. So
Yeah.
before we get a bunch of like hate mail, which we haven't gotten any hate mail yet. I'm like, I guess we can't be that big of celebrities if we haven't gotten any hate mail yet, Jeff.
That's how you know you've made it, when you get the haters.
Yeah, well, you have to have some haters or else you're nobody.
Right.
That's what I hear anyway. But yeah, I mean, it's certain use case, but that's where it all comes back to exactly what we were stating though, which is risk. Like you have to know your risk. You have to know your risk profile. And if single individual accounts do pose high risk, and it shouldn't be every account, right? It shouldn't be like every account in your Active Directory poses a huge amount of risk. I guess that's possible, but it seems to me that there's going to be levels of risk. And what we're talking about here is the ability to prioritize. We're not saying you shouldn't go as far as you can to secure your network, but assuming you have limited resources, which seems to be the case for everybody, you have to decide where to put your pennies.
Yeah, that is a good point. I think knowing where your secrets lie and what's important is a big part of being able to protect it. If you don't know what those are, that should probably be one of the first things you work on is, what are we trying to protect and does it make sense? There's an article today, I think I saw in the paper today, which is May 14th. There is some, and I'll butcher this, I'm sure, because I don't have it in front of me, but there was a law firm that got hacked, and apparently they fell victims of some ransomware and have had some of their data dumped, including, contracts and things like that. And apparently they do work with celebrities. So I'm sure there are probably sensitive things in there, right? Attorney-client privilege type things. And maybe something comes out of it, maybe not, who knows? But if it's, could be 5 clients, that's going to be 5 clients too many, especially if they are very high profile, celebrity type people.
That's right.
That's a much different use case than, I'm just trying to break into Capital One, right, or Experian and get, records for hundreds of thousands of users indiscriminately, right? I'm not targeting any specific individual. And I think a lot of times.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I was going to kind of pivot to the change in how these breaches tend to lead to, let's say, management changes, right, or ownership changes. And that was one of the things that the report identified, was that 71% of the organizations had gone through some sort of ownership change of IAM within the last few years. And that, that was pointed to as one of the reasons why. And I think it was, let me look here, 46% of the reasons why there was a change in ownership of identity management was attributed to a security breach. So they were responding to a security breach and assigning new ownership because of that.
Yeah. And then if you look at, I'm not sure where it fit into, they had a lot of charts in there, but one of the things I saw was to better align IAM with information security. So in other words, there's a recognition that, management of who has access to what is critical to securing the organization. And if information security is the folks that we tasked with running security and securing the organization, they should run IAM as well. It's not right for every organization. I mean, we get asked all the time, what's the best practice? Or, in other words, where should we organize IAM? And I think there's competing interests. I think that IAM is closer to application development than any other area of information security. There's a lot of business logic, a lot of oftentimes custom code. There's a lot of interfacing with applications. There's a lot like middleware in a lot of ways. It's security, but there's a lot of operations behind it. And information security is usually, in a watchdog mode, or let me say, from my experience, a lot of what information security will manage is a lot of um, security infrastructure, firewalls, um, monitoring, logging type platforms. And then IAM becomes kind of a different challenge. It becomes probably the most complex thing in a CISO's portfolio. And so it becomes a challenge from that perspective, and that it's not the traditional role of the CISO to run something like that. On top of that, IS's role, relative to business applications is kind of as a watchdog to make sure things are being done according to security protocol, according to security policies and standards. And what you have is a potential conflict of interest where you have application middleware that you're the owner of and you're the watchdog for. And so I've always felt like that was a bit of a conflict of interest. I'm not saying that should prevent you from keeping IAM in information security. In fact, that's typically where I tend to think it does belong the most. But I can see that being I feel like we need to have that conversation more often because I don't think it's something that should be glossed over.
Yeah, I I agree mostly, maybe partially with what you're saying. My viewpoint is that, and we've talked about this before, is where should IAM belong to? I don't necessarily care as long as there is an owner and that person's aware of it and it's been defined. I tend to think that IAM needs to be broken up into more of like a plan, build, run type approach because of what you just said. Some security teams are really good and have good operations and good developers, and it's part of the process, and they're equipped to support that. Others not so much. They rely on an infrastructure team to stand up technologies and tools, et cetera. So I feel like the planning, the governance, kind of the oversight, security is a good spot for it, generally speaking, although, like you said, not right for everybody. And parsing out the build and the run, potentially keeping in security or letting other organizations run it as long as, they're following kind of the rules of the road. And the reason I say that is because I feel like security has a better understanding of security challenges around identity and access management. Again, not always the case, but you would certainly hope that security has some capability in that regard to be able to guide people along the right way rather than developing processes or standards that are insecure or not as secure by design. So, even if, let's say, IT security is not part of the IAM planning or governance model, they should at very minimum be part of the stakeholders of like a steering committee or a key influencer in how those things get developed and implemented at the organization, whether it is policy, standard, or even technologies.
You brought up a really good point there that information security groups are evolving and do have a lot of the personnel now that maybe traditionally they didn't have, but the security tools are evolving and they do have the developers within InfoSec now. The
Yeah,
other thing is,
DevSecOps is kind of a newer thing, right?
yeah, the
Relatively
other
speaking.
thing is like I think you can be flexible in terms of um, I think you can be flexible in terms of delivery. Not, organizations don't have to have everybody reporting to one person in order to work on that one person's projects, right? You can have a kind of a matrix organization. You can use developers from other organizations to work on IAM and still have IAM organizationally fall into information security. I think that's all
Hmm.
right too.
I think it's
We've
really
seen
hard
that a
though.
few times.
I
I
think
think
that's
we've
hard
seen
though
it a
because
few times.
I've seen it a few times, but it requires really good coordination between groups and a very clear understanding and of the RACI of how that's going to work. Because when every time you have shared resources, there's always that competition for time, right? And whether that's there or not, if an individual feels like they're splitting time between two different things, sometimes it doesn't work out as well. So I agree that it should be there, but it requires a lot of coordination between the teams that are sharing resources and really having that understanding of what's the priority for individuals to be working on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the things that it's an area that requires experience. So you can't just it's not like custom development where you can swap resources in and out. It's more
Right.
like ERP where you have to and usually IAM gets very platform specific after you get onto whatever vendors you're going to move forward with, and then you need people who really understand how those systems work. And so you can't have new developers kind of coming and going all the time. Otherwise, without that continuity, you're not going to have a whole lot of success, I don't think.
Yeah, exactly. I think those were the highlights for me when it came to this report. Is there any other highlights or any other comments you want to bring out there before we wrap it up for this week?
Yeah, just the I'm not sure I really understood this coming out of the report on how they determined what a forward-thinking company it was.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things they talked about was that companies that are forward-thinking, I'm doing the quotes even though I know this is audio. The forward-thinking companies were much less likely to um, have had a breach within the past year. I think that's indicative of what that says to me is companies that invest in planning and getting ahead of things are less likely to be breached. Uh, that certainly makes sense intuitively. Again, there's so many factors that go into building a survey and like how they classify what a forward-thinking company was. Was it
Right.
simply that they asked the respondent, is your company forward-thinking?" Which
Yeah.
isn't very scientific. But at the same time, I think if you're in a company that doesn't invest in technology and you now have had a breach within the past year, um, that's maybe how it was developed. Do you know more about how they came up with that?
Not specifically, but I think the same thing as what yours. It's the way I interpreted it is more of a, here's a reason to justify making the investment in identity, whatever that investment looks like, right? It could be, oh yeah, we really should put MFA in place, or maybe we do need adaptive authentication, or maybe we do need, automated onboarding, offboarding, right? Whatever your problems are, um, if you are at least thinking about it and making an investment to solve it, it sounds like there's a payoff there. I would want to probably read the report a little bit more and try to discern it. But the way I saw that question was, here's, if you're looking for some justification to make an investment, here you go. Investing does have a measurable impact on breaches. How
Right.
much you invest and what that impact is probably open for debate, but there is some correlation there that can be derived.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense.
That's me, full of sense.
50 Cent. We're going to start calling you 50 Cent.
Please don't.
All right. I mean,
I don't want to be discounted.
it doesn't really fit you anyway. You don't really
Right.
remind me of 50 Cent.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been in the club or anywhere near that. That's never been my scene, but more power to those that are. I'm definitely more straight laced, I guess would be the right word, or boring, maybe, as people would say it.
Do you know what though? You're comfortable in your skin.
Hey, I am who I am, and that's all I am.
That's Popeye.
Was that a pun for I am?
That's Popeye.
Oh, is
I
it?
am
Okay.
who I
Well,
am, and that's all I am. Yep.
yep. And then I squeeze a thing of spinach and eat the whole thing at once.
I've never seen you do that.
All right, we've gotten really crazy here, so it was probably a good spot to leave it for right now. We'll go ahead and wrap it up. You've been listening to Popeye and Jim from the IM side.
That makes me wimpy, right? Popeye and Wimpy, or Bluto.
Yes, I don't know. You seem to know an awful lot about it, so as the foremost expert on Popeye, I'll defer to you.
I'll take it.
Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week, and we'll talk with y'all in the next one. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.